One day, Howard Hughes was the face of aviation and Hollywood. The next, he vanished into isolation, leaving his empire to slowly rot from the inside. What drove this billionaire genius into total seclusion, and how did it all come crashing down? Early success. Howard Hughes wasn't just rich, he was driven. When he inherited the Hughes Tool Company at 19, he had one thing on his mind: building something bigger than his father's oil drill business. So, in 1925, he packed up and moved to Hollywood. His first film, Swell Hogan, was a bust, a project so poorly received it never even hit theaters. But that failure didn't slow him down. In 1930, he poured $4 million into Hell's Angels, a World War I aviation film. Hughes wasn't interested in shortcuts. He demanded realism and reshot scenes endlessly. He even commissioned new cameras to capture aerial shots. The filming process was dangerous. Tragically, 3 pilots died during production, but Hughes' gamble paid off. When Hell's Angels finally premiered, it was a massive hit. He earned recognition as a talented, albeit obsessive filmmaker. But Hollywood wasn't enough. Hughes had a deeper passion: aviation itself. He wanted to make his mark in the skies, so he founded Hughes Aircraft in 1932. It was a modest start, but he was determined to grow it into a powerhouse. He set aviation records, pushing the limits of speed and daring. In 1938, he flew around the world in 91 hours, setting a new record and cementing his status as an aviation hero. America was captivated by the fearless young millionaire who seemed to conquer every challenge. The rise of Hughes Aircraft. Hughes Aircraft started small but grew fast. By the early 1940s, the company was thriving, securing defense contracts that would fuel its expansion. The U.S. military saw Hughes as a visionary who could create advanced aircraft designs to support the war effort. Hughes Aircraft became known for its relentless push toward innovation, and it wasn't long before it was producing groundbreaking technology. But Hughes wasn't just interested in ordinary planes. He wanted to redefine aviation. The company began designing military aircraft that could fly higher, faster, and more efficiently. Hughes became obsessed with creating the largest airplane in history. The H-4 Hercules, known later as the Spruce Goose. Made mostly of wood due to wartime metal shortages, it was massive, designed to carry troops and equipment across oceans. Building it cost Hughes millions, $23 million by the time it was ready in 1947. The Spruce Goose flew exactly once, a brief test flight for just over a mile, but it was enough for Hughes, who insisted the plane wasn't a failure. For him, it was proof of what Hughes Aircraft could achieve. Critics saw it differently, calling the project a costly joke, but Hughes shrugged it off. His company was evolving. By the late 1940s, Hughes Aircraft was shifting its focus to electronics, radar systems, and missile guidance technologies. This pivot proved strategic. The defense contracts kept pouring in, and Hughes Aircraft was now a major player in military technology. RKO and Hollywood failures. In 1948, Hughes made one of his boldest moves yet. He bought a controlling interest in RKO Pictures for $23.5 million. RKO was one of Hollywood's Big Five studios, and the acquisition marked Hughes' return to the industry that had first put him on the map. But Hughes didn't just want to own a piece of Hollywood. He wanted to control it, and he had no intention of being a passive studio head. For Hughes, RKO was more than a business. It was his personal playground. Unfortunately, his style of management didn't fit Hollywood. Hughes took a hands-on approach at RKO, overseeing almost every detail of production. He approved scripts, made casting decisions, and micromanaged filming schedules. He was obsessive, demanding constant rewrites, reshoots, and casting changes. Directors and actors were replaced at a moment's notice, sometimes with no explanation. Staff members found it impossible to predict his decisions. If Hughes didn't like something, it changed immediately. This unpredictable management style soon brought RKO to a grinding halt. Films were delayed, projects were abandoned, and the studio gained a reputation for chaos. Hughes' personal life further complicated matters. He had a habit of casting his romantic interests in lead roles, often ignoring established talent in favor of his latest fascination. Actresses like Faith Demergue and Jean Peters became fixtures at RKO, but the favoritism came at a cost. Executives were frustrated, feeling Hughes was more interested in his personal life than the company's success. Actors and directors grew wary of working at RKO, knowing that Hughes's whims could disrupt their careers at any moment. The instability at RKO wasn't just bad for morale, it was disastrous for business. Lawsuits piled up from actors and staff who'd been unceremoniously dismissed. Film budgets spiraled as projects were endlessly revised, and box office returns couldn't cover the mounting expenses. By the early 1950s, RKO was hemorrhaging money, and the company's reputation had soured. What was once a respected studio was now seen as a Hollywood disaster zone, thanks to Hughes's erratic management. In 1955, Hughes finally threw in the towel. He sold his shares to General Tire and Rubber Company for $25 million. Financially, he came out even, but RKO was left in shambles. Under his watch, the studio had lost its luster, its talent, and its credibility. Hughes walked away with his finances intact, but his time at RKO exposed a darker side to his personality, a side driven by obsession, control, and self-interest, even at the expense of the empire he'd hoped to build. RKO was his Hollywood dream turned nightmare, a high-profile failure that marked one of the first real cracks in his once unshakable empire, obsessions and relationships. Hughes's need for control wasn't just limited to his business dealings. It spilled into every part of his life. By the 1950s, his controlling tendencies were getting harder to ignore. His close associates, employees, and even friends began to see the cracks. He trusted few people and insisted on overseeing every detail personally. This constant need to micromanage began to strain relationships. At Hughes Aircraft, employees felt the impact of his obsession. Projects would be delayed because Hughes would second-guess every decision. He often issued strange, cryptic directives without explanation, leaving employees confused and frustrated. Hughes's fear of corporate espionage made him paranoid, leading him to tighten his grip even further. No one else had real authority, and any attempt to challenge him was shut down. Outside of work, Hughes's relationships were deteriorating. He rarely socialized, preferring solitude, and even his closest friends found it hard to reach him. He distrusted everyone, and his growing paranoia led to strange behavior. He would communicate through written notes instead of meeting face-to-face, fearing germs and unwanted company. This isolation created a toxic work environment at Hughes Aircraft, where secrecy and distrust became the norm. Hughes' desire for control was damaging his empire from within. The delays, the lack of communication, and the constant turnover of employees created an unstable foundation. Partners and colleagues started distancing themselves, and Hughes's reputation as an unmanageable, eccentric recluse began to take shape. TWA, acquisition and financial strain. Hughes's obsession with control went far beyond his Hollywood ventures. It extended to one of his biggest business triumphs, Trans World Airlines TWA. Hughes had acquired a major stake in TWA back in 1941, seeing potential to expand it from a modest airline into a global powerhouse. Over the years, he poured millions into TWA, upgrading its fleet and building its brand. By the 1950s, TWA was competing directly with the biggest airlines, including Pan Am, and Hughes was determined to make it the most modern airline in the world. But by the 1960s, that ambition was running up a huge bill. Hughes wanted TWA to lead the jet age, so he arranged a massive purchase of Boeing 707 jets. The deal required loans totaling over $400 million, a staggering amount. However, Hughes wasn't willing to pay the debt himself. He insisted TWA should shoulder the burden, claiming the airline, not him personally, had ordered the new jets. This decision did not sit well with TWA's board. They saw it as Hughes using the airline's money for his own gain, and they worried he was putting TWA's financial health at risk. Tensions exploded into a full-blown legal battle. TWA's board accused Hughes of financial mismanagement, arguing that his actions jeopardized the company. Hughes predictably dug in. He fought the board's attempts to limit his control, determined to hold on to the airline he had shaped for over 2 decades. The lawsuits dragged on for years, draining both TWA's resources and Hughes's focus. The legal turmoil created instability, frustrating investors, and damaging the airline's reputation. In 1966, after a lengthy court struggle, Hughes faced a final blow. He was forced to sell his TWA shares. The sale brought in $546 million, a huge sum, but it felt hollow. TWA wasn't just a business to Hughes, it was part of his legacy. Losing it was a personal defeat, and it struck deep. He had spent decades shaping TWA, pushing it to the forefront of the aviation industry, and now it was out of his hands. The money from the sale didn't last. Hughes poured much of it into other ventures, many of them failing projects that would never see a return. The loss of TWA marked a turning point in his empire. It was more than just a financial setback, it was a blow to his identity. TWA had been a symbol of his success in aviation, a reminder of his days as a daring pilot and visionary. Losing it left Hughes with less control, less power, and a dwindling fortune. Paranoia and reclusiveness. By the late 1950s, Hughes's behavior was raising serious eyebrows. His obsession with control had shifted into full-blown paranoia. He was becoming reclusive, isolating himself from both his businesses and the outside world. People who had known him in his younger years barely recognized him. The once social, high-flying billionaire was now hiding from the world. His reclusiveness wasn't subtle either. He checked into the Beverly Hills Hotel and turned it into a fortress, blocking off entire floors. Staff reported that he rarely left his room. Food and supplies were brought directly to his door. Even basic interactions with his employees became rare. He communicated through handwritten notes, often cryptic and barely legible. The notes baffled his staff, but no one dared question them. His reclusive behavior fed rumors, some saying he was slipping into madness, others speculating he was terminally ill. Then came the move to Las Vegas. Hughes took over the Desert Inn in 1966, initially as a guest, but when management pushed him to leave, he simply bought the hotel. He stayed in a penthouse with blackout curtains drawn, living in almost complete darkness. This move marked the beginning of his Las Vegas takeover. Over time, he acquired several other hotels, properties, and even a local TV station. His isolation was now extreme. Hughes relied on a small team of aides for everything. His long hair and uncut nails added to his unsettling appearance, fueling rumors of a mental breakdown. Despite his odd behavior, he was still making decisions about his businesses, but they were often erratic and without explanation. Hughes's reclusiveness created a communication vacuum, leaving his companies adrift. Key figures were gone, replaced by yes-men who followed orders but offered no guidance. The empire he once ran with an iron grip was beginning to crumble in his absence. Lawsuits, debt, and a crumbling empire. After the forced sale of TWA in 1966, Hughes faced a new wave of financial and legal problems. Losing TWA wasn't the end. It marked the beginning of relentless struggles to defend his remaining assets. The $546 million he received from the sale didn't bring peace. Instead, creditors, former partners, and business rivals saw weakness. They came after Hughes for delayed payments, outstanding loans, and even damages for past dealings. Lawsuits began piling up. Hughes was stretched thin. The costs of litigation, combined with his shrinking empire, quickly drained his resources. He spent millions in legal fees, defending against claims ranging from unpaid debts to alleged mismanagement. Each case chipped away at his finances and focus. The constant legal battles left Hughes scrambling to keep his empire intact. But he was losing ground fast. In Las Vegas, the hotels Hughes had once purchased as a symbol of his influence were now financial burdens. They were underperforming, and his financial reserves were dwindling. Without Hughes's presence to oversee operations, the managers and aides left in charge often made poor financial choices. This only deepened the debt. Hughes's reputation as a successful businessman started slipping, replaced by murmurs of instability and chaos within his companies. Meanwhile, Hughes Aircraft was also struggling. Once a leader in defense and aerospace, it began losing contracts to competitors. With Hughes distracted by his legal issues and physically absent from management, the company was left without the guidance it once had. Executives who relied on his leadership were left to guess his intentions. The company was becoming a shadow of what it once was, and Hughes was powerless to stop it. Throughout the late 1960s, Hughes's empire was shrinking, not through growth or innovation, but through desperate attempts to cover his losses. Lawsuits and debts became the new norm, consuming his energy and draining his wealth. His empire, once a symbol of daring ambition, now felt like a series of fires that he couldn't put out. Hughes's grip on his assets was slipping, and his focus, once sharp, was blurred by endless battles and a crumbling financial foundation. Hughes Aircraft and internal corruption. With Hughes caught up in legal issues and isolated from his businesses, Hughes Aircraft began to suffer. The company had been one of his greatest successes, a powerhouse in defense technology. But by the late 1960s, it was becoming a shadow of its former self. Hughes was barely involved, leaving his top aides in charge. But without his direct oversight, things quickly went downhill. Corruption crept in. Executives took advantage of Hughes's absence, making deals that benefited themselves rather than the company. Mismanagement became rampant. Projects were delayed, costs skyrocketed, and quality slipped. Employees who had once admired Hughes's vision were disillusioned, frustrated by the lack of direction. The Defense Department noticed the changes. Contracts that once flowed freely to Hughes Aircraft were now going elsewhere. The company was losing credibility in the industry. The leadership vacuum created a culture of secrecy and infighting. Executives fought for control, with some taking liberties that would never have been possible if Hughes had been paying attention. Even worse, the company's innovative edge was fading. Hughes Aircraft, once known for cutting-edge technology, was now struggling to keep up. The groundbreaking work on radar systems and missile guidance was largely forgotten, replaced by infighting and inefficiency. Hughes's empire was decaying from the inside, and he was too isolated to notice. By the early 1970s, Hughes Aircraft was no longer the defense industry giant it had been. Government contracts were drying up and profits were plummeting. Hughes had lost control over one of his most valuable assets, and his empire was shrinking. The empire he had built, with its focus on technology and innovation, was coming apart, and the man who had created it was nowhere to be found. Health and empire decay. Hughes's physical health was declining as rapidly as his empire. Years of isolation, neglect, and untreated conditions took a toll on his body. By the early 1970s, Hughes was barely recognizable. Once known for his dashing looks and charm, he was now gaunt, with long, unkempt hair and nails. His diet consisted mainly of milk and chocolate bars, and he reportedly refused any medical treatment. Hughes's substance use was rampant. He relied on codeine and other painkillers, often taking doses far beyond what was safe. This dependency dulled his mind, impairing his ability to make sound decisions. The effect on his businesses was disastrous. He was so removed from reality that he couldn't see the damage his inattention was causing. Hughes Aircraft, the medical institute, and his Las Vegas properties were all suffering. His absence created a power struggle among his aides, who had their own interests. Some were siphoning funds, others were making unwise investments. And Hughes, lost in his own world, was powerless to stop them. The empire Hughes had once managed with precision was decaying, its foundations eroding. His physical and mental decline only sped up the process. He rarely left his dark, isolated rooms, and he trusted no one to manage his companies. His paranoia intensified, making him increasingly cut off from reality. By 1976, Hughes was barely functioning. His health was in ruins, his empire was in free fall, and the once powerful figure was now a shadow. Final years. Hughes' final years were a tragic end to a once incredible life. In the early 1970s, his health continued to spiral, and he became a ghost in his own companies. His closest aides made critical decisions without consulting him, often acting in their own interests. Hughes himself was often unaware of what was happening. His assets, once worth billions, were bleeding money. The Hughes Medical Institute, his last major project, was one of the few assets that survived. He had set it up as a charitable organization, but it became a lifeline for his finances. However, Hughes was so removed from his companies that he barely knew about its operations. As his empire fell apart, the Medical Institute remained untouched, a strange contrast to the chaos elsewhere. In 1976, Hughes died on a flight to Houston for medical treatment. He was a mere 90 pounds, a far cry from the powerful figure he had once been. When he passed, Hughes left no will, and his estate was thrown into chaos. His assets were scattered, with a lengthy legal battle over his fortune involving distant relatives, former employees, and even fake claimants. The companies Hughes had spent his life building were broken up. Hughes Aircraft was sold to General Motors, the Las Vegas properties were auctioned off, and the remaining assets were divided among the claimants. The Medical Institute eventually grew into one of the world's largest private foundations, but it was far from the empire Hughes had imagined. Hughes's empire had crumbled, and the man who once controlled it all was gone, leaving behind the wreckage of an empire destroyed by his own obsessions and excesses.